As you all know, the theme of the day is learning together. With more universities than anywhere else in the UK, the Knowledge Quarter is a centre for learning and skills. Sadly, the pandemic has had a shattering effect on young people in the labour market. Camden and Islington councils have set out next generation initiatives in response, and have invited support and participation from local organisations in regard to youth employability, skills programmes, mentoring, virtual working opportunities, and more. How can the Knowledge Quarter work together to offer training and work experience across multiple businesses, encouraging local employment and essential engagement with local schools? Beyond apprenticeships, there is scope for significant outreach to the local youth population. And whilst the obvious focus might be in the later years of secondary education, there's also an argument for earlier interventions with primary school children. With the presence of several higher education institutions in the KQ, both big and small, how can we ensure that our education support and outreach prioritizes students from the lowest income backgrounds? We're going to look towards finding answers to these and other questions in our panel now, The Future of Learning Together. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers for this panel. We've already met Raymond, and he's going to be sticking around. Josh Hillman is Director of Education at Nuffield Foundation. He leads the foundation's work in education, encompassing both research funding and student programs in STEM and quantitative skills. Josh was formerly head of education policy at the BBC, where he was responsible for development of education policy and partnerships with the BBC's output across media for children and adults. Josh was Deputy Chair of Governors at an inner London primary school for 5 years. The Right Honourable Lord David Willetts served as a Member of Parliament for Havant between 1992 and 2015, and as Minister for Universities and Science between 2010 and 2014, and has previously worked at Her Majesty's Treasury and the Number 10 Policy Unit. Lord Willetts is President of the Advisory Council at Resolution Foundation, a visiting professor at King's College London, a governor for the Ditchley Foundation, chair of the British Science Association, and a member of the Council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He's also an honorary fellow of Nuffield College in Oxford. His book, The Pinch, which focused on intergenerational equality, was published in 2010, and he's recently published another book called A University Education. Carol Homden, OBE, is Chief Executive of the Quorum Group of Children's Charities and also serves as Chair of the National Autistic Society and is a trustee of the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and is a former member of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales. Having started her career setting up print media enterprises in East Anglia, she moved to London as a freelance arts journalist and became the first public relations officer at the then Polytechnic of North London and Director of Marketing and Development at the University of Westminster. Our participatory chair for the session is Omar Salha, a PhD Nuhud scholar at SOAS, University of London, and a lecturer in international diplomacy and soft power and British politics. Omar is also a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts and research fellow at the Islamophobia Studies Center at Berkeley in California. Omar is the founder and chief executive of the Ramadan Tent Project, an award-winning non-profit organization established in 2013 with a mission of bringing communities together to better understand each other. This is done through several of its key projects and programs, and notably the UK's largest cultural community event in Ramadan, Open Iftar, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. He's a regular contributor to many international and national print media, and he fluently speaks Arabic, Turkish, and English. Thank you all for joining this panel. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Bav, and good afternoon to all of our viewers and, of course, our distinguished speakers. It's a pleasure to have you all, and a huge congratulations, if I may say, and begin with, to the conveners and the organizers behind the Knowledge Conference. I think it's amazing to see so many wonderful contributions being made over the past day and a half, we can say, and for the next day and a half that we have left over these 3 days. Yesterday, the conversation and the day was focusing around the future of working together. today the future of learning together, and tomorrow the future of growing together. If I may say so, not because that I am part of this panel, but I think the learning aspect of the three is, in my opinion, probably the most important, in that if we are not going to learn some of the past experiences, that we're unable to grow from them and work together as well. But of course, it's a cyclical process, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, to work, to learn, and to grow. And they all involve in us wanting to explore new ways of learning and working together. This panel will be focusing a lot on the importance of understanding the significant gaps and challenges that were faced under, of course, the current pandemic. And hopefully we'll be able to understand a little bit more from the expertise that we have here with us today about the key challenges, about the key ways for us to actually overcome those challenges, and of course the impact that COVID has had on the education sector, both in higher education, but of course young people and those preschool as well, which is a very important point to note. I understand we have a little under an hour, and I feel it's very important that we've got many here to offer their insights and expertise. So I think I'd like to begin with the first question, if I may, which is focusing on how can the Knowledge Quarter offer the training and work experience across multiple businesses, encouraging local employment and essential engagement with local schools. Of course, we have seen the universities in particular in this Knowledge Quarter, one of which SOAS is based in, of course, where I am connected with. Sadly, the pandemic has had a massive negative effect, particularly on those studying from home and joining us. So I'd like to begin with handing over to Lord Willits first for your contribution on this, and then we can move on to other guest speakers today.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to join you on this panel, and it was great overhearing what Raymond Antrobus was saying earlier. The Knowledge Quarter is fortunate in that it's already got a range of higher education institutions with a range of missions. I was actually in Central St Martin's only the other day. Of course, there's UCL, and probably very relevant for all this as well, there's Birkbeck, which does a fantastic job of reaching out to mature students. So it's got a range of universities with diverse missions. One starting point, which I think has suffered recently, is universities to recognize they have a civic mission. And even if they are in their research, they're collaborating with people around the world. I think a really good test for people involved in the running or doing research at any university is what we're doing in any way serving the square mile within which we physically are located? And looking at the other way around as well, are there within the square mile where we are located social and economic problems that our institution can do something about? So I think the square mile test is a very good discipline, however global the mindset of the institution. That's my first point. And my second point is that I personally do think that despite all the difficulties of delivering education during the pandemic, it has driven a shift to online learning and education technology that will not be reversed. We've seen more innovation in the past year than in the past 20 years. Initially, of course, some of it's pretty amateurish, and in the first stage of the digital revolution reaching any sector, first of all, you do exactly what you're doing before, but you record it and you stick it online and you have a discussion like this discussion, which might a year ago have happened in a physical space. But it really gets interesting in the second stage when people realize they can use digital resources to do things differently and innovate in pedagogy. And of course, there will always be the physical interaction with teachers and fellow students. But I think we are now going to see significant innovation in how we are educated. One of the barriers, which was limited access to laptops and Wi-Fi, is still a problem, but the government has had a program of providing laptops for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, which is slow to gear up, but has now had considerable success. So we're making progress in removing that barrier. And I do think we are due to have a debate about exactly how we can use the data that is now available on how people are learning, where the education debate is way behind the health debate on patient data. There has to be an ethical framework. But in theory, knowing exactly from the keyboard how every individual learner is interacting, what is they are moving rapidly on, where they're getting stuck, what they're getting wrong, why they're getting it wrong, what they're interested in, is a fantastic resource. So some combination between a recognition of the roots of an institution in its square mile and boldness in innovating in education technology to spread access to education would be two things I would have at the top of my list.
Thank you very much for that, Lord Willett. I want to move over to Josh, if I may. I think a key point that Lord Willett mentioned there is obviously the digital innovation. And there was research conducted around the increasing gap between rich and poor pupils, which I understand the Nuffield Foundation also helped fund this research, which was done at Cambridge University, if I'm not mistaken. And I think I just wanted your feedback on that, and actually also just a bit about the increasing inequality between rich and poor students, and also the catch-up, if you will, in terms of how can the knowledge quota in particular, but also how do we reduce that widening gap, particularly with the digital innovation that we are facing within the educational sector.
I really enjoyed Raymond's presentation, and a couple of things I picked up from it which are relevant to what you've just asked me. I mean, one is the importance of language right from birth, and it's clear that he had a very rich background in where language was absolutely central. And we'll come on to that because I think that's been an important sort of foundation of the problem that we've had, particularly during the last 18 months, is during a period of isolation with kids being out of school. But the other thing is that the area that we're talking about, the knowledge quota, is an exceptionally rich area, and there's attention for all the institutions within it in terms of serving their local community, but also they're all national institutions that have, particularly with the use of digital technologies, the opportunity to enrich the experience of children and young people right across the country. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen in the past sort of 15 months in particular is that schools have cut back for a whole range of reasons, obviously partly to do with social distancing, but also partly because of prioritization in the face of the challenges that they've been facing on all of the sorts of enrichment activities that are provided potentially within the knowledge quota. And so I think when you have to look at it that way. Now, the research that we funded, which was looking at both what's been happening from the school perspective, but also in the domestic perspective during the course of the 15 months, has shown a huge divergence between the experience of children within schools, depending on their social background, but also between schools in the experiences that they've been able to offer their children. And that wasn't just within the first lockdown. That's been a sustained issue. Even when schools haven't been locked down, they've been focused on helping pupils to catch up, dealing with social distancing, which has a negative impact on learning. We're just about to publish some research showing that the kind of one-to-one contact between teachers and pupils is inhibited by the need to have literally distance between them and pupils. The ability to give one-to-one feedback has been inhibited, and the practicalities of delivering all sorts of aspects of the curriculum, both in the core curriculum, but in the around the edges, for example, practical work in the sciences, bringing people like Raymond into the schools to help support and boost what can be provided by the teachers. All of that has been harmed. So what the research that we've funded has shown is that damage that has been done is not just for this particular cohort, but will have a sustained effect on pupils within the schools.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. And actually, on that point, and on building on the research, I know that we've discussed, and maybe perhaps even the attention has significantly been focused more so on secondary education. So I wanted to actually turn to you, Carol, a little bit on the importance here on the interventions within primary school and actually preschool, so early years as well. What has the impact you have witnessed or seen over the past 18 months? What more needs to be done to bridge that gap?
Well, hello, everyone. Very nice to see you. I think to answer your question directly and then broaden out to the main questions, I would say that opportunities that you do not have as an infant, you do not recover. So your neurological development, it happens and must happen within defined parameters. And if you do not have the opportunity to be spoken to develop your oracy, to develop your numeracy, then you will be at a disadvantage throughout your whole learning experience. If you do not become an effective learner, then your chances of becoming an effective earner are very significantly reduced. What we have seen during the pandemic is in fact not the creation of issues, but an amplification of issues that we had already created all by ourselves. So before the advent of the pandemic, school exclusions were at their highest level ever. Autism was the single biggest presenting disability in education, health and care plans. There were more children being presented to children's social care than ever before. That was the situation before the pandemic. And the pandemic has amplified and accelerated those issues. Quorum has been working on these issues here since 1739. Looking at the trajectory of history, there is, of course, a vast improvement in access to education and to social opportunity in our society since Thomas Quorum established his charity to provide care for children who were illegitimate, abandoned, stigmatized, and felt unworthy. Thinking now around the Knowledge Quarter, it dismays me that the combination of organizations so far classified within the Knowledge Quarter does not include Quorum, which is an institute for the future of children and both research active and a deliverer of lifelong learning, or indeed any of the other major charities that are engaged in directly addressing the barriers for our children and indeed for our local communities. So that is, of course, the first gap to fill. And I'm absolutely with David, which is the absolutely crucial importance of civic responsibility, but also what I would describe as personal generosity. The keepers of knowledge must share that knowledge and give their time in the service of others. So I'm really excited at the opportunities for the Knowledge Quarter, perhaps not 1 square mile, but 10 square miles. And to become working in consort with organizations like Quorum and respectful of the kind of knowledge that we have, to fundamentally change the 3 R's, the reach, the relevance, and the results, as a movement of motivation. So you are most likely to become an architect if your parents are architects. You are most likely to go to university if your parents went to university. Who is it that each member of our 100,000 strong community of students is helping? To whom are you extending the ladder of motivation? So Quorum provides the largest youth drama festival in the world. What might you be doing to help? We provide 1,500 reading volunteers and reach 350,000 children a year in schools. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a single volunteer from within the Knowledge Quarter. We run accredited programs and have links with the universities, for example, of South Bank, Essex, and Newcastle, with accredited programs to increase the access to justice and legal information. When would UCL like to get involved? So I actually think the moment is now. The power is within our hands, and we need to put knowledge into action.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that contribution. I think in many ways, the question that we will get to is what are the key changes that need to be made. I think there are some really important recommendations that you have made. And I think I speak on behalf of Ramadan 10 Project as well. We would love to use this as an opportunity to actually engage with Quorum. And I'm sure the organizers at Knowledge Quarter would very much welcome that opportunity as well. So I think this is one of the joys of this conference, is the beauty behind convening and connecting people and looking at how we can, again, learn from different perspectives and actually look together to, as you say, put knowledge into practice. I'd like to actually build on some of the important points that have been brewing now around some of the headline sort of conversation points that Raymond, you were talking about earlier, which was cultural capital. And ultimately the Knowledge Quarter, and I think we're all in agreement here, shares one of probably the highest concentration of soft power, British soft power in particular. Some of the world leading institutions, the education sector, we know, of course, we're talking about learning together, are found in Britain. It is still, despite the obvious COVID pandemic difficulties and challenges faced, we still see several students and international students that I know of who are still keen and interested to come and travel to London in particular and study in some of the institutions within the Knowledge Quarter. And actually refer back to Albert Einstein's quote here, which is, knowledge is not in the learning of facts, but in the training of the mind to think. And I suppose this is what Carol, you were speaking about a bit earlier, around putting that knowledge into practice. So Raymond, I think, do we need a shift really? And I think almost the key word here was radical, maybe revolutionize the way we look at education. And maybe what was perhaps this pandemic almost an alarm bell going off and almost to sort of shock us into thinking perhaps we need to be more creative in the way we teach and almost more creative in the way we learn as well.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I think so much of what's been shared here is just the beginning. Again, I feel like just skimming the surface of really deep, complicated issues. But yes, I advocate for obviously creative thinking, lateral thinking in our education. I'll just tell you, I'll tell you a quick kind of story. So I won this thing with the Ted Hughes Award a few years ago, and it was such a catalyst moment for me for so many different reasons. But one of them was being in my first book, I'd come across this poem called Deaf School by Ted Hughes. The brief story of that is in the early 80s, Ted Hughes was asked to, by the National Theatre actually in South Bank, was asked, how do people live without language? So this was the question he was given. And Ted Hughes decided to go to a deaf school in London and just spend one day observing learning happening in a deaf school, in a deaf classroom. Just to bear in mind, Ted Hughes knew no sign language. He had never interacted with a deaf person, so he knew nothing about the very rich and historical culture that of deaf people which they have. So he's very much an outsider, but he's gone into this deaf classroom and he ended up writing this poem called Deaf School, in which he compares the children to monkeys and to fish, and he says that they're simple. And I even put some of the words in the book because when I read the poem, and again, I was someone who, Ted Hughes was one of the first poets whose collections I would read from first poem to last poem. And so Ted Hughes was someone, again, who was a big part of my culture capital growing up, and someone who I engaged, even his children's literature, the Iron Man, for example, all of these things. So it really hurt actually seeing this poem. So he says things like deaf children are alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound, of responses to sound. And so what I decided to do in this poem was respond creatively to the gap in which, where Ted Hughes was coming from as a hearing person who doesn't know anything about deaf culture or deaf people, their language, and put this in a poem. So my creative response was to put the poem first in the book and just redact the whole poem so you can still see the shape, the exact shape of this poem that it made. Then I took some of the images that Ted Hughes used and personified the Mississippi River. I happened to be in New Orleans while I was writing this poem, and I looked at the river, this huge presence of a thing, and just decided to speak as the river back to Ted Hughes. So I get the river to direct the same logic that Ted Hughes used back to him. So I say, Ted is alert, Ted is simple, Ted lacked a subtle waving or a sound of responses to sound, right? So that's the poem that comes after the poem. But when I go into deaf schools in particular and share this poem, one really powerful response I had from a deaf learner, a deaf student, recently had cochlear implants, 2 cochlear implants put in, and I showed him this. And I told him the story about Ted Hughes. He said, can you just turn the page so it looks like that? Sorry, so it looks like that. And yeah, and he said, oh, this looks like the screen of my audiologist when he is using the audio channels on my cochlear implant. And it was such a powerful moment because it offered an opportunity, a creative way in to talk about something which is hurtful and harming, but it shows, again, there are other ways to think about our relationship with information, with knowledge. So that was such a kind of one example of a powerful interaction I had where everyone in that classroom, including the teachers, were able to chime in that discussion and learn something about about where Ted Hughes was coming from, about deafness and deaf culture, and then to create something that's very visceral and visual. So then again, talking about the diversity of learning styles, it just encompassed everything. And so after that particular session, they said, the students who were really quiet and often don't contribute to lessons were engaged. They wanted to know the story. They wanted to know more about Ted Hughes as well. So it's just, this is what I advocate for, and these are the ways that I try to find, the gaps in our classroom and in our learning and our thinking and in our language.
Thank you very much for that, Raymond. I think the underlying message here, ultimately, the key word is belonging. I think the power of being able to bridge between different communities, and of course that is within the deaf community and the wider community as well, in this example that you share, but also respectively within the Knowledge Quarter, the various different communities that live within this very rich quarter here is. The key word is belonging, and creating a space where there is coexistence and co-creating, but I suppose also co-curating spaces where actually people can come together to design and look at design learning and actually education in that sense. So with that in mind, and I think some of the points that you mentioned here, and perhaps Raymond, you can share a little bit, and then I can hand over to Lord Willett as well. We spoke about the soft power of the Knowledge Quarter, and understand and appreciate and acknowledge there are several organizations, how big and small. How can we ensure that the education support and outreach does indeed prioritize students from the lower income backgrounds? What more can be done, can be put into place to try to address some of the earlier points that we discussed in the first round of questions around the clearly identifiable knowledge gap that has come about and it may be even exacerbated under this pandemic?
Just to say something to that, I guess I grounded this whole my keynote in culture capital because I wanted it to kind of show the importance of school trips, of school outings, of actually engaging in real time with the environment, because there are literally stories put in stone and on plaques on our buildings and all of that kind of thing. And from what I understand, I've gone into so many schools now and tried to arrange school outings and school trips, and I'm constantly just barraged with bureaucracy, and these trips don't happen. So one of the ways that it seems that culture capital is not being capitalized on in a way that it's gone down. It seems that there are less school trips happening now. And I really want to say that we're just missing a huge opportunity there. But then given in the kind of talk about the pandemic, of course, that complicates everything. So I don't really know, and I don't understand why so many cuts are still happening as well. So even during the pandemic, I did a talk for, I know it's a different borough, but for Tower Hamlets. And I was meeting teachers there who told me that £4.5 million was cut from their special educational needs budget during the pandemic. 4.5 million. And I don't really understand where that money goes, or who's making these decisions. But my guess is the people who are making these decisions aren't people who understand things like culture capital, things like the need for diverse learning, and how complicated special educational needs as an umbrella term is. And so one statistic that's really stuck with me, and I'm not sure if this is still true, but when it was last conducted, this survey, 75% of people born profoundly deaf in the UK grow up illiterate. And so someone who's come out of a deaf school and interacts with that community, I can see the limitation that in terms of opportunities that are open to some of my peers, some people I've gone to school with, and how stuck they've been and how even more isolated they've felt during the pandemic. So I also want to just kind of give some voice to that as well.
Thank you for that, Raymond. Lord Willits, if I may cross over to you again, any sort of general points that you have with some of the stuff that you've heard, but also in respect to this particular point around education support, outreach priorities, lower income, bridging the gap. And of course, as we've seen in the past couple of months, actually, research has come out that longer hours at school will not make up just the catch up at school. We need to think of more creative solutions.
Yeah, and obviously the pandemic has exacerbated some of these big social and economic divides, and access to education, sadly, is indeed one of the examples of the effects of the pandemic. I think there are different groups who have been affected in different ways. A group I particularly worry about actually is teenagers, people in their late teens. I personally think, and when you look at public policy priorities, there's been a kind of protection for school budgets up to the age of 16. And despite the controversy around the 9K fees that I introduced, it did at least boost the money for educating students at university. I think 16 to 18-year-olds of a group who have never been protected by schools funding pledges, and haven't been supported in other ways. And the transitions they are currently making out into college or apprenticeship or university are even tougher, big fall in the number of apprenticeships. So I would make them a focus of attention. I think secondly, and I'm sorry to come back to education technologies, but I'm a member of the all-party group on education technologies, and we've done some research into how they can help tackle the very problem you're asking about. And so one practical suggestion is there is, for example, quite a large pot of money for a tutoring program to help school students who have lost out by not getting proper access to schooling during the epidemic. But the guiding model is this is personalized one-to-one tutoring, which in turn has become a major supply constraint, holding back the number of students that can benefit from it. I think you should be more imaginative in having a blended option where, of course, there should be individual contact, but also you can have well-targeted online education resources part of that program. So I think, we have in these very tough times to be inventive and innovative as well.
Thank you very much for that, Lord Willits. Carol, I'll come over to you. Again, the same sort of discussion point here, and anything that you may want to add, or any insights that you have with regards to what has been shared so far.
Well, it's a rich and interesting discussion, and Lord Willits is right in what he would say. And I mean, I agree with him about the 16 to 18, perhaps 16 to 19. I think the first year of university has not been the experience that we would want for our young people in that life stage. But I think the 16 to 18-year-olds, but particularly the ones that are not on the A-level pathway, because the ones who are on the A-level pathway, frankly, are ones who are effective learners and, will be more likely to thrive within the digital environment. I'm unsure really how the digital environment helps you if you're not an effective learner to become an effective learner. It's a tool to access resource, but like so many other initiatives, actually amplifies the benefit to those who have as opposed to those who do not, which is why perhaps I have a little more sympathy for the notion that special time is the thing that children may most lack, and the interests of someone who's alongside them. And the second thing I would say is that I think that Lord Willits is right about that, but the group I most worry about are the group that we actually lose before they start their GCSEs. So they're held pretty well in primary schools. Primary schools are actually pretty effective communities of support because they're quite small and because there is much more engagement with families. You move from a 300-child primary school to a 2,500 secondary school, and if you're not engaged in constructive relationships, if your family is not well engaged in education, if you struggle with the demands being made upon you, you have already left by the time you're 13. And so, in my view, most of the education catch-up, if we want to call it that, or engagement initiatives are too little and much too late. So that focus on Key Stage 3 is where Quorum places its focus. In addition to, if you can't read, then all other bets are off. And therefore, certainly in infancy and in primary, I find it absolutely extraordinary that something in the region of 120,000 children a year leave British schools where there is a statutory entitlement to education unable to read. And I do think that there needs to be a kind of greater focus on what will that take. This is a personal view, but schools are very constrained by national curriculum boundaries, which whilst they provide an important platform of expectation and entitlement, for my son, who is autistic with learning disabilities, the fiction that he was possibly going to study French was an insult. And we would be better off focusing on him being a functional reader, which, thanks to the lowest paid learning assistant, he is. So I think we really need to think about some of our priorities. I'm sure ministers are agonizing against that, around that. And I also think that there is a key challenge for government on how blunt the tools are in their box and how difficult it is to actually create initiatives that have high quality, scalability and stickability. And I do think for us here in the Knowledge Quarter, we should also be prepared to not keep saying what others should do, but what we are going to do.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Carol. Josh, there's been a lot being said on this topic, particularly this point around what can we do and how can we, in many ways, try to close that gap. There's also one thing that's maybe we've touched upon, but a lot of significant focus is on mental health as well. We've seen many practitioners that talk about, okay, we can discuss the solutions of how to close this gap. And one of the solutions was looking at longer hours at school, for instance. But if those longer hours at schools are not filled with engaging interventions, then that may almost actually do the complete opposite and actually almost create more anxiety and with regards to children's mental health, despite the fact that we are all going through a very difficult period. So maybe a little bit around that, if you may, and also but the general points that we have discussed as well.
Yes, I do want to come back to the question you asked about what organisations within the Knowledge Quarter can do to bridge the experiences within the square mile, but beyond, in terms of from children and young people from different backgrounds. I mean, it's clear to me that working with individuals can have an absolutely transformative effect, but it's intensive. You can't do that through a superficial type of exercise or intervention. As an example, we fund a program called Nuffield Research Placements, where students from disadvantaged backgrounds could spend 4 to 6 weeks in research institutions, several of which are within this Knowledge Quarter, Arup, UCL, Royal Veterinary College, and so on. And all of the evaluation that we've undertaken of that program shows that for those individual students, it's a life-changing experience along the lines of that Raymond was talking about in a different context. Now, we have to work incredibly hard to make sure that those opportunities reach disadvantaged students. Left to their own devices, a lot of those sorts of transformative opportunities automatically go to those families and those peoples who are able to develop the networks to experience that. So I think the main point I would make towards the organizations in the Knowledge Quarter is you need to be very, very strict about where those opportunities go, because they're a scarce resource. They require time and, to use Carol's word, generosity on the part of those organizations who are offering them. At the moment, I would say it's fairly tokenistic, the way that that most organizations approach that sort of role that they play in tackling disadvantage. And so that's the main way I would address your earlier question. Those sorts of experiences actually have a huge effect, not just on academic outcomes, but on non-academic outcomes and all the sorts of broader skills that employers are constantly crying out for and say that the education system is not delivering. Team working, collaborative work, problem solving, all those sorts of things. But also, when I talked about that being a transformative experience, that's not just transformative in terms of their opportunity, it's in terms of their sense of self and their ability to connect with others, their ability to work with groups of people, that the mental health benefits of those sorts of experiences, which I do think that a lot of the organizations that fall under your aegis can address is significant.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'd like to go back and start with you, Lord Willits, if I may. A question which I'd like to ask all our panelists is, if we had a sort of a magic tree which didn't have any constraints on budgetary requirements, what would be the first policy you would want to introduce to try and help us with this current situation that we find ourselves in, particularly within the Knowledge Quarter, but of course, as a nation, looking post-pandemic, as we understand, full legal restrictions are going to be soon to be lifted, and of course, timing that with obviously the summer holidays that are happening, but also in preparation for the new academic year, but also generally speaking as well, I think, what are the important things if we're going to be talking about the future of learning together, now knowing we've seen the challenges of the past 18 months, what are your respective policy recommendations which you want to bring in? And with, of course, I know Raymond mentioned earlier the problem of bureaucracy. Let's negate that as well.
Well, I'm grateful to you for wishing away almost all the constraints that we normally face. And if only. I mean, I'd go back to something that Carol said, if I may. She said, without literacy, I would add numeracy. And I personally, and I don't know if you're just asking about school kids, but I think we should look across the age range, and there are just too many people in the UK of whatever age who don't have the literacy and numeracy required fully to participate and to enjoy the kind of cultural capital that Raymond Antrobus was talking about. And there have been various attempts over the years. There's been programs, and the Nuffield Foundation and others have helped ensure they are assessed. But sadly, we are no longer making any progress in reducing literacy and numeracy, in rates of people, the numbers of people who don't have literacy and numeracy. And if anything, it's possible that because of the pandemic, that problem has got worse. So I would, and not simply in a school context, I would, I would for both literacy and numeracy have imaginative programs delivered by institutions not solely in schools, and helping adults as well as young people. And though I say, again, I'm really not obsessed with education technology, but I do think there is an opportunity here which we're currently ignoring. I was checking the figure while we were talking. There have now been over 1 million laptops and tablets delivered to low-income families for the fear that if you do any online education, they simply don't have the resource to participate in it. Having gone to the effort, slow to start off, but having now gone to the effort of distributing over 1 million laptops and tablets to low-income families, they are a potential education resource that can be used. And I would have exciting literacy and numeracy programs, some of them delivered online, for kids who might well be playing computer games, which incidentally are brilliant at sustaining attention and concentration, which is a key part of pedagogy as well. And try to deliver programs focused on literacy and numeracy for them and for other age groups as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Very concise. And I think if we can ask for the same from the others. Thank you for that, Lord Willis. Let's go to Carol, please.
Well, it's almost a dream question and therefore almost impossible to answer. But and at want of being slightly politically controversial, I would say that we need to look at how the funding mechanisms actually follow your needs as opposed to your aspirations. So just an observation before I answer your question, which is Lord Willits will be aware of the longitudinal studies from the United States on the return on investment if you tip the funding equation on its head and you actually invest most in the beginning. So we currently don't do that. We absolutely don't do that. Our most disadvantaged children are not getting access to early education. There is a rationed provision of sometimes, put under the heading of childcare. It is sometimes put under the 2-year-old offer and so on. But if you all know that if you start badly, you finish less well. So I would say that there needs to be a recalibration. It's currently off the policy agenda, expressly off the policy agenda. And the other thing I would say from Quorum, which is very old and extremely hopeful, is it's also never too late. But the most important thing, a very wise person said to me once, was worry less about what individuals are learning, worry a great deal more about whether they love to learn. So the only job of a primary school is to excite the love of interest in something. And then children will actually want to learn to read so they can find out more about the insects or poems or motorbikes or whatever it is from which all else follows. We do have a great tendency to diminish the love of learning by the processes and procedures we put around it. So I'll leave it there for now. But the other thing I would say is let's celebrate the fact that we actually have a generation of children who are probably achieving more than any previous generation. But it's in all our interest to talk about how they're not.
Here, very good point. Thank you very much, Carol. Josh, if I can pass over to you, and then we can hand over to Raymond after that.
Yeah, I'm in chiming agreement with David and Carol. I mean, my two priorities would be early years and those young people post 16 who are not taking the A-level university route. I think those are the two areas where if you have some money shaking off a tree, that's where I would divert them. And I'm particularly thinking about the early years, just to reinforce the points that have been made. It's not just about the sort of financial returns to early investment in terms of earnings and so on, but it's the compound effects of getting things right before children start school, particularly thinking about their language skills, their very foundations of numeracy and literacy, which are acquired in really high quality early years settings. That foundation has huge payback throughout the way they learn in primary school. So, we have a slightly bizarre situation where some of the most underpaid people within the education system, often, not much above minimum wage, have this fundamental important role in interacting with children at this very critical point. Of course, it's right that if you get things wrong early on, there is the opportunity for children to catch up and to have earlier deficiencies and delays supported through high quality primary teaching. But it just makes so much more sense to get things right so that they can enjoy and benefit from primary school from their first day.
Thank you very much, Josh. Raymond, quick thoughts on this. And I mean, it seems there's a lot to being. I think we should just roll out a national poetry program, and then we've answered everything.
I think there is real potential. I think there would be a really strong case to be made for that. Put a poet in every school. I really do think that there'll be I could get you the data. Give me 3 years and a good bit of funding. I will get you the data to show the power of the poets in the school, or at least just imply the use of lateral thinking in our education. I just want
like a pitch to the Nuffield Foundation for some funding, Josh.
Yeah, I'm down. I'll be down. I mean, I've been going into school for the past 10 years, and so I've got a canon of anecdotes. But so just to say, I mean, I totally cohere with everything that has been said there, particularly from Carol. And so what I was thinking, because we're talking about language and language acquisition, this is something I've been kind of thinking about a lot. I'm about to have my first kid born, and he's literally going to be born in the borough, UCLH. He's due in September, and so I've been thinking a lot about how do I carry on some of the wealth from which I received in my education at home. So what I found out recently is that the first language that most of us are speaking before verbal language is actually Macinton. BSL, sign language, is begun. And I don't understand why we don't carry on, especially when we know how much, all the data shows how bilingual young people manage to develop faster if they have more than one language. So I would love to make that a kind of mandatory thing. And that would be such a powerful way to integrate BSL into the culture of Britain, of the UK Britain. I think we can literally start it from there and then put BSL on the national curriculum and have more people learning it. I'd also then make it mandatory to have more school trips. Every school ought to have more funding for school trips. Poet in every school. I'd also talk about, because we spoke about mental health, I think a lot of the teachers that I've worked with in the past have needed emotional and mental health support as well. And I don't see any support for that, for the actual people who are caring, who's caring for the carers, that kind of thing. I mean, I know that's quite a lot to throw into one thing. And lastly, because I'm all about creating and developing creative communities in schools, having student mentor programs where older students, and this is one of the most powerful things I've seen in the American schools that I've worked in, American schools that have qualified counselors and psychotherapists on site in schools. This is something I've never seen in the UK before. I really think if we had a better relationship with mental health and there was less stigma around it, we would be able to implement that and really see the benefit from some of the American schools that I've worked in. Because again, focusing on emotional literacy, it can be really, some students really open up about their emotional lives, and then there isn't the support for them when they leave the classroom mental health wise. I can't tell them to just go and see the school counsellor who's only qualified to a certain way. So, you know, infrastructurally, there's so many. It's been a painful, frustrating road, I think, for all for all teachers, and then you just get burnt out, and then you try and do something from outside of the system. But those are just some policies that I would wish, if I could, just wave a wand and make mandatory for which I think would benefit all of us and all styles of learning.
Raymond, I think you've thrown some useful gems there, and I think those are amazing recommendations. I think I would fully support those recommendations as well as some of the other that have been shared. The reason why we ask this question is it allows us to set the scene setting, really, of what is the ideal sort of situation we want to find ourselves in, and of course work our way slowly to that, whether that be through collaborations or partnerships, or for sure the important F word here is funds. And so Carol, I think you had a brief comment to make, if I'm not mistaken, and then we can move to some of the questions that we have from the audience as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think Raymond is inspiring. Unfortunately, we may not have 20,000 poets of the same quality, but I'd be very happy for it to embrace drama. It's not an accident that Coram Shakespeare Schools Foundation takes that view. But I wanted to make one very fundamental point, which is that you can only learn if you feel safe to do so. And you can only learn if you're not hungry. And we really must not allow our interest in wider policy matters to distract ourselves from the fact that we as a community must commit to every child here in Camden having enough to eat and feeling safe enough to learn. And we all have to ask ourselves what we're actually doing to ensure that. And, you know, for example, in the institutions in the Knowledge Quarter, zero food waste. You know, some of these core corporate social responsibility commitments are ones that we actually ought to galvanise within the Knowledge Quarter in conjunction with Camden Council. And actually, we have plenty of resources. This is one of the richest countries in the world. You wouldn't believe it, but it is. So some fundamental commitments to the prerequisites, I think, are essential.
Thank you very much for that, Carol. We've got two questions here, so I'll ask one question to both Carol and Josh, if I may, and the second question I'll ask to Lord Willett and Raymond. So the first question to Josh and Carol is from Stephen Robinson. He asks, if our aim is to make education more inclusive, do we have to consider changing the whole assessment, exam, and qualifications setup? If we have Carol's start, and Josh, you can follow up.
Well, I would start by saying let's not pay any more people to design any more systems and review any more processes. I mean, what's wrong with the qualifications framework we have? We have an outstanding qualifications framework that is used in many countries in the world in many regards. So I can entirely see what the questioner is asking around education being more inclusive. But I think that is around the parity of esteem that we give to different types of pathways of learning and to individuals themselves. So, you know, I shared an example of my son who does have very complex needs. The most important moment of pride and achievement in his entire life is the achievement of the Duke of Edinburgh's award. And I could not be more proud. I hope you are too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Carol. Josh, your feedback and comments on this question.
Yeah, I take a slightly different view. I mean, the last summer, and indeed carrying on this summer, has shone quite a bright light on our assessment, examination and qualification system, and I think has called into question what precisely the role of GCSE is in a world in which almost every single young person stays within education up to the age of 18. So I do think there is an opportunity there to question what the point of it is. I'm not suggesting that there's no assessment at that age, but I think there's a question about that. But something I feel more strongly about is the over-specialization in the 16 to 18 age range, where there was a period where that went up from 3 subjects to 4. It's gone back down to 3. I think that's just too specialized. We're one of the most unusual countries in that respect. And it's not just about the number of subjects, it's also about the lack of opportunity for those other broader skills and qualities that we've been talking about earlier to be brought into the 16 to 18 curriculum. And one in particular that we've been very concerned about is numeracy, quantitative skills, understanding of statistics, which are just fundamental to existence. The vast majority of young people give that up at 16, and I think that's a real problem with our system.
Thank you very much. Moving on to question number 2, and the final question, I hope, before we end up, it is to both Lord Willett and Raymond. The question is, to what extent are rising tuition fees a barrier for young people entering into higher education? We can begin with Lord Willett.
Well, I hope it's not. It certainly shouldn't be. Of course, this is not money that young people pay up front, and nor is it a debt like a debt on a credit card or a bank overdraft. It's essentially you pay back through income tax if you're in a well-paid job afterwards. So it shouldn't deter kids from disadvantaged background. If any were deterred, that would be a tragedy. And fortunately, the figures show that we've had an increase in the number of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds going to university since I brought in those fees. And there's a reason for that, which is that with the fee system, you also don't control the numbers of places at university. So universities can expand. In the old system, to control public spending, you control the number of places. That's why there's more disadvantaged kids going to university in England, where we have fees, than in Scotland, where they don't have fees, but do have controls on a number of places. So fortunately, I understand people's concerns, but fortunately, it's not had that effect. We've got to carry on doing better, though. Although the numbers of disadvantaged students is going up, it's still much lower than the proportion of kids from advantaged backgrounds going to university, which is one reason why we need to carry on growing university places. If it's a zero-sum game, and the only way a disadvantaged kid can get there is if someone much more advantaged doesn't get a place, it's going to be a very tough battle. But I'm a believer in growing university places, and above all, hoping that means that we continue to see more kids from disadvantaged backgrounds going.
I think this is quite a specialized question, one that I haven't looked at the data for. I mean, and my response would just be a gut one, which would be, well, not everyone thrives in the environment that is provided by universities. And I'm only going to be speaking on my own personal testimony. I didn't go to university until much later, and that was through scholarship. In fact, I'd never been to university until Goldsmiths reached out, and they wanted me to be part of piloting their spoken word education program. So all I want to say to this is that there are other avenues, but unfortunately, when you're outside of a system, there's no network, so you can get very lost if you don't have a kind of support around you. Can I nominate Carol to answer this? I reckon I'd like to hear her response.
Absolutely. Carol, would you please?
Well, the Lord Willits is right, actually, in terms of what the data shows. And, many years ago, I was a director of marketing in the university sector, and I'm delighted that the rest of the sector has caught up with that particular sector that used to be called the polytechnics. But I think that the issue actually is more nuanced than we realise, or perhaps have paid attention to. I do think there is the fear of debt, whether there is a reality of debt or not. I think the second thing is actually dependencies, other people being dependent upon you in family networks. But fundamentally, I sort of revert back to the question that it's less that the fees are a barrier for those who have the aspiration. Indeed not. And I think personally it's an equitable system that those who earn should return. But I think it's those we lose earlier on from that aspiration, which, you know, I don't disagree with Josh, incidentally, around the GCSE curriculum in that regard, that we're losing too many of the young people earlier on, and that's more of a barrier, actually.
Thank you very much to you all for your amazing contributions. I know we've just a little bit run over time, so apologies for that. But again, with something like this and a very important discussion and conversation, I think we could almost have this panel turn into a conference in itself, and in many ways pick up on some of the very important analyses, but also recommendations to take forward. And I really do hope that this conference does become a platform to take on board some of the very key points that I'm sure all of us here respectively have been asked and actually have faced over the past 18 months. But now moving forward, how is it that we are able to work collaboratively within the quarter, but of course, almost as an example for the nation as well to roll out. There was a question about what I would personally change. I think between us, there is an incredibly rich level of expertise and experience. And I think at Ramadan 10 Project, we pride ourselves in connecting and convening between different communities. So I would say the solutions are out there, but actually they're amongst us. And I think we should not wait or expect this solution to come to us on a silver platter. On the contrary, I think between us only just through this discussion, I'm really excited about the possibilities of working together. And Raymond, look, as one avid poet, to a poem reader, let's say, I want to pick up on the prominent English poet John Keats. I like to end with this quote, which is, "Every fresh experience points out some form of error of which we shall afterwards carefully avoid." And I think that succinctly puts together the experience we have faced. And I think before we rush back to the old normal, perhaps this is our moment to create a new normal, taking on board some of the recommendations we have shared. And I do believe to reform the self and the systems and institutions and processes that we have implemented and continue to develop, we are able to achieve a social model that is more compassionate, ethical, inclusive, and equitable for all. So I want to thank you all very, very much. And I hand over now to Bav.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And I'll just leave you on the screen just to say thank you so much to all of our speakers, Josh Hillman, Lord David Willett, Carol Hunden, Raymond Antrobus, and brilliantly chaired by Omar Salha. Thank you all so much.